Module 3, Lesson 5, we continue with our understanding of working with opposites of numbers on a number line. Now we're going to look at how to write them as an equation. And when we write them as an equation, we have to understand what each piece of that equation means linguistically. So your first objective is that you understand the opposite is written as a negative, parentheses, and then the number on the inside. This negative represents the word opposite, where the parentheses represents of. So this would be the opposite, parenthesis of, and then whatever number that is. Your second one, I understand that the opposite of the opposite is written as a negative, parenthesis, negative, and then whatever your number is. So again, that means opposite, and that means opposite, or opposite of, opposite, or number. I can locate and plot opposite numbers on a number line. Now, opposite of the opposite, as I already said, you write it this way. Now, you work from the inside out, so you can't forget that we start here with our number. So this is number 1. And then we go out here, and we do the opposite. So that's step 2. And then you go out here, and that's step 3. So we start with our number, we do the opposite of that number, and then we do the opposite of that number. Below is an example. So they want to know the opposite of 3. So our first step is we start with our first one right here, the opposite of 3. So this is the opposite of 3, which is negative 3. So again, this is opposite, this is my of 3, which is negative 3. So my answer is negative 3. I keep my parentheses, so I have my negative 3. The only thing I have left here is this last opposite. And so I have the opposite of negative 3, which equals 3. So my answer is 3. So the opposite of 3 is 3. Your second example, we have the opposite of negative 5. So the opposite of negative 5. So I start with my opposite. So again, this is my number is step 1. Step 2 is right here. So find the opposite of negative 5 equals 5. So this whole thing equals 5. And then I still have the opposite of 5, and the opposite of 5 is negative 5. Now, the answer then is the opposite of negative 5 is negative 5. If you look here at the number line, this is kind of how you would show it on a number line. So we started with a negative 5. So I plotted my point at negative 5. My first step was finding the opposite of negative 5, because again, we had to find the opposite of the opposite. So that would be the opposite of negative 5. So step 1, my number, graphed it. Step 2, find the opposite of negative 5. So here's my line here. Opposite of negative 5 is 5. So I go over here to my 5. Step 2, or the last step, is then find the opposite of 5. The opposite of 5 is negative 5. So then we jump back over. We're right back where we started. So down here we have those steps. So your first step is you graph negative 5, the number. Second step, find the opposite of negative 5, because it's opposite of, that parenthesis, of negative 5. So opposite of, and then find the opposite of negative 5. So find the opposite of negative 5. Well, we found that it was 5. So then we have to find the opposite of the opposite, which was number 2, which would then be a negative 5 again. What you see here, and you need to remember, is that the opposite of the opposite will be the original number given. No matter whether it's positive or negative, opposite of the opposite just brings us right back to where we started. Now I'd like you to open your book to Module 3, Lesson 5, so we can begin our book work. Lesson 5 for Module 3 begins here. So it says first, to locate the number negative 2 and its opposite on the number line. So I'm going to locate negative 2. So step 1, plot your point. and its opposite. Step 2, find the opposite. So the opposite would be the same distance from 0. So this is my opposite. Now, the way that I would write this as a number would be the opposite of -2 equals 2. Next, write an integer that represents each of the following. 90 feet below sea level would be -90 feet. A $100 of debt would be a -$100. And 2 degrees above 0 would be a positive 2 degrees Celsius. Now again, we don't need to put positive because we usually speak about numbers in positive. The negative would be the only time we have to write that down. Now, Joe is at the ice cream shop, so we're going to talk a little bit more about location. So Joe's at the ice cream shop, and his house is 10 blocks north of the shop. So remember, we have to do a compass. So this is north, south, east, and west. And he's 10 blocks, so here's his house. 10 blocks north of the shop. The park is 10 blocks south of the shop. Now, if you look, the shop, our ice cream shop, is in both of our phrases. That means that our ice cream shop is our reference point. And so that means that our ice cream shop has to be represented with 0. Now, we are going to be using a vertical number line because we're using north and south. So if we're going north and south, we're going to go ahead and like this. This is our road. And our ice cream shop is our reference point, which would be our 0. Now, his house is 10 blocks north, so that means his house would be here, and that's 10 blocks north. And then the park is 10 blocks south. South is below 0, which means it would be represented with a -10. And so here's my park. When he is at the ice cream shop, is Joe closer to the park or his house? How could the number 0 be used in this situation? So 0 is the reference point. Which is the ice cream shop. And the reason I know it's the reference point is because they're asking who's closer to the ice cream shop. So if this part is in the question, this is your reference point. This is what they want you to compare things to. And then who is closer? Well, they're the same distance from 0, or they're the same distance from the ice cream shop. So they are opposites of each other. So we have 10 and -10, which means his house and the park are 10 units from, or they actually tell us blocks, so you can actually use the word blocks, from the shop. So 0 is usually a starting point or a reference point, whatever they choose to talk about. So let's go ahead and go to example 2 here on the back. So the opposite of an opposite of a number. So what is the opposite of 8? How can we illustrate this number on a number line? So they're going to take us through the steps. What number is 8 units to the right of 0? 8. How can you illustrate locating the opposite of 8 on this number line? So we need to go ahead and make this. If we're going to do the opposite of 8, we also have to have a -8. So I'm going to take -8 down here. We're going to do -7, -6, so we're going to start here. So again, first step, the number you were given. So you're going to plot your number. Number 2, step 2 is find the opposite. So the opposite of 8 is negative 8. So what is the opposite of 8? Negative 8. So here's our step 1. This is our step 2. And then use the same process to locate the opposite of negative 8. So we're over here. So negative 8 is the opposite of 8. And then we go back around. 8 is the opposite of negative 8. So the opposite of an opposite of a number is the original number. And the way that you'd write that is the opposite of a number equals the number. Now remember, this can be a negative, it's just whatever this would be. So that negative means opposite, my parenthesis means of, that means opposite, and then that means of, and we work our way out. So we go opposite first of the number, and then we do the opposite of that one. So this is 1, and that's 2. So we go from the inside out. Now, instead of doing cards in your group, I'm just going to give you numbers that you'll use. And what you'll do, we don't need to do a person. I'm just going to give you numbers, and you're going to say the opposite of the card and the opposite of the opposite. And they show you how to write that. So we're going to do 9. You're going to do negative 5. You're going to do negative 3 and 2. And you're going to go down here, and you're going to have to write the opposite of negative 10 as an equation. So what I need you to do is finish this table and do 1, 2, and 3. When you're finished with that, bring it up so that I can check your work and move you on to the problem set.